Santa Monica, California, June 7, 1938. The morning mist has not yet lifted from the coast when Carl Cover pulls on his leather gloves and walks toward the aircraft waiting on the Douglas tarmac. He has flown everything the company has ever built. He has crossed continents in prototypes, coaxed machinery through its maiden hours, stood at the edge of the unknown and pressed forward without flinching. But this morning is different. This morning he is about to fly the future. The machine before him is unlike anything the world has seen. 4 Pratt & Whitney R2180 twin Hornet engines hang from a wing that stretches 238 feet from tip to tip. Its fuselage is pressurized. Its landing gear is of a revolutionary tricycle configuration, the first on any large aircraft in history, placing the nose wheel forward so that the aircraft sits level on the ground, dignified and composed. Like a monarch surveying its dominion, it is the Douglas DC-4E. The E stands for experimental. What they do not yet know is that the word will take on a second meaning, an uncomfortable one. To Carl Cover, none of that uncertainty exists on this morning. He climbs into the cockpit of the most technically sophisticated transport aircraft ever built by American hands, and he runs through his checks with the methodical calm of a man who has never doubted the machine beneath him. The engines turn over. The sound rolls across the tarmac like thunder, measured and controlled. And when the DC-4E lifts from the runway at Clover Field, it rises not merely into the California sky, but into the mythology of American aviation. What Cover does not know, as he banks over the Pacific and feels the aircraft respond with almost docile grace, is that within 18 months, this aircraft, this gleaming triumph of American industrial ingenuity, will be sailing not west across the ocean, but across the Pacific under entirely different ownership, and the men who will receive it will believe with absolute conviction that they have purchased the key to air dominance over the Pacific. They are wrong, but they will not know it for years. Before we tell this story, we must stand at its end and look backward, because this is not a story of triumph. It is a story of the crushing, methodical, and ultimately irreversible weight of a fundamental misunderstanding, not merely of an aircraft, but of an entire philosophy of aviation development. 6 aircraft. That is the complete production run of the Nakajima G5N Shinzan, the aircraft that the Imperial Japanese Navy would build by reverse engineering and reimagining the Douglas DC-4E. 6 aircraft against a requirement for not fewer than 25 operational bombers. 6 aircraft, none of which would ever drop a bomb in anger. 6 aircraft, all of which would eventually be stripped of their military pretensions and reconstituted as unglamorous transport haulers. The Shinzan, whose very name means mountain reverberation, evoking the thunderous power of a weapon that would shake the heavens, never reverberated at all. Its maximum speed was 260 kilometers per hour at altitude. The American B-29 Superfortress, which would ultimately end the war, flew at 577 kilometers per hour. The Shinzan's service ceiling was somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,000 meters, barely adequate for a commercial airliner of modest ambition, catastrophically insufficient for a heavy bomber expected to survive the lethal altitudes of Pacific combat. Its payload, after accounting for fuel sufficient for any meaningful mission radius, was effectively negligible as a strategic weapons platform. The men who flew it knew it. The admirals who had ordered it knew it, but the process of knowing had taken years, and those years had cost Japan something it could never recover: time. This is not a story of cowardice or incompetence. The engineers at Nakajima Aircraft Company were among the finest in Asia. The naval aviators of the Imperial Japanese Navy were among the most experienced combat pilots of their era. The failure of the Shinzan program was not a failure of individuals. It was a failure of institutional knowledge, the kind of knowledge that cannot be bought, cannot be reverse engineered, and cannot be acquired through any shortcut, no matter how ingeniously conceived. It was the inevitable consequence of believing that a machine's secrets live in its rivets and its blueprints, when in fact they live in the 10,000 hours of incremental refinement that produced those rivets, and the institutional memory that decided where each one belonged. In hindsight, the outcome was inevitable from the moment the DC-4E lifted off Clover Field in June of 1938. The logic of empire, why Japan was certain, to understand why Imperial Japan was so confident, We must understand what they believed they were acquiring, and why that belief was entirely rational, given what they could see. By the late 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Navy was not a force that lacked imagination. It had produced the Zero fighter, a machine so far ahead of its contemporaries that American pilots would at first refuse to believe their intelligence reports about its performance. It had built aircraft carriers that the world's other naval powers spent years attempting to match. The Navy Air Service had combat veterans forged in the fires of China, pilots who had flown offensive missions under live fire, and returned with the kind of experience that peacetime training simply cannot manufacture. Japan's air arm was not naive about warfare. It was, in many respects, ahead of the world. But there was one area where Japan knew it was behind: heavy, long-range strategic bombing. The kind of capability that could threaten an enemy's homeland from outside his defensive perimeter. The kind of weapon that, in the doctrinal thinking of the 1930s, represented the ultimate evolution of air power. The British were theorizing about it. The Americans were building toward it. And Japan had nothing comparable. The requirement that would eventually produce the Shinzan was designated the 1-3 Shi Large Attack Aircraft, submitted in 1938. The specifications were breathtaking in their ambition. The Navy wanted an aircraft capable of carrying a meaningful bomb load over a range exceeding 4,000 kilometers. It wanted high-altitude performance, sufficient speed to complicate enemy interceptions, and enough structural integrity to absorb the rigors of oceanic patrol. It was, in every technical sense, a requirement for a miracle. Nakajima Aircraft Company accepted the challenge, and when their engineers began wrestling with the sheer scale of what was being asked, they did what any rational engineer would do when confronted with a gap between what exists and what is needed. They looked for a starting point. They looked for a machine that had already solved some of the fundamental problems of very large aircraft design. They looked, in other words, for something they could learn from. What they found was extraordinary good fortune, or so it seemed. In 1939, through commercial channels that were entirely legal and above reproach, Japan and the United States were not yet at war, and the DC-4E was not a military aircraft. The Imperial Japanese Navy arranged for the purchase of the one existing Douglas DC-4E prototype. The aircraft had been retired from active development. American Airlines had evaluated it and found it wanting. Douglas had already moved on to a different design philosophy. The DC-4E was, from the American perspective, an expensive dead end. A machine that had taught them everything they needed to know about what not to do. When the Japanese paid for it and had it dismantled and shipped across the Pacific, the Americans let it go without particular alarm. What they didn't know was that Japan believed they had purchased not a failed experiment, but the blueprint for the future of Pacific air power. The machine itself. What made the DC-4E extraordinary? To understand the depth of Japan's misjudgment, we must first understand what made the DC-4E genuinely remarkable, and why the misjudgment was so easy to make. In 1935, when United Airlines, American Airlines, and TWA came together and presented Douglas Aircraft Company with their joint specification for a new generation of airliner, they were asking for something that had never existed. The existing DC-3 was a magnificent machine, possibly the most important aircraft ever built in terms of making commercial aviation commercially viable. But it was limited. Its range was limited. Its passenger capacity was limited. And as the 1930s matured and the world's air routes expanded, those limitations were becoming increasingly apparent. The airlines wanted a true transcontinental aircraft, something that could cross the United States with a meaningful payload without stopping in the middle of the country. Something with pressurization, so passengers could be carried above the weather in comfort. Something large enough to be economical at scale. They wanted, in essence, the foundation of the modern airliner. And Douglas, with the confidence of a company that had already transformed aviation once, with the DC-1 and DC-2 and DC-3, set out to build it. What emerged from the engineering offices at Santa Monica was by any measure a genuine technical achievement. The DC-4E spanned 238 feet. It had 4 engines producing a combined power of 5,840 horsepower. It could carry 42 passengers in pressurized comfort, an almost luxurious standard for the era. Its tricycle landing gear, with the nose wheel in front rather than the tail wheel configuration that dominated aviation, gave it groundbreaking taxi visibility and dramatically reduced the risk of the ground-looping accidents that plagued conventional tail-dragger designs. The pressurization system alone represented a significant engineering achievement. Creating an airtight cabin of that volume, maintaining it against the differential pressure of altitude, and doing so reliably enough for commercial operations was not a trivial problem. Douglas solved it. They also incorporated de-icing systems, advanced autopilot integration, and a level of pilot accommodation that made long-haul operations genuinely feasible. On paper, and in the air during its early test flights, the DC-4E was everything its designers intended it to be. The problem was what it cost. Not merely in dollars, though the dollars were extraordinary. The problem was what it cost in operational complexity. The aircraft required a 5-man crew to operate properly. Its maintenance requirements were substantially higher than the DC-3 it was meant to replace. Its fuel consumption, driven by the demands of pressurization and 4 large engines, meant that its economics, the fundamental measure of an airliner's worth, were deeply problematic. United Airlines calculated the numbers with the ruthless precision that commercial operations demand, and the numbers told a story that no amount of engineering elegance could contradict. The DC-4E was too expensive to operate profitably at the fares the market would bear. It was too complex for the maintenance infrastructure of the period. It was, in the clinical language of commercial aviation, uneconomical. All 3 airlines declined to order production aircraft. Douglas, recognizing the verdict, accepted it. The prototype was retired. The lessons were absorbed, and Douglas's engineers went back to their drawing boards with a clearer understanding of what the next aircraft needed to be. That next aircraft, the DC-4, shorn of the E, simplified and rationalized and made economical, would become one of the most important transport aircraft of the Second World War. The American military would know it as the C-54 Skymaster. President Roosevelt would fly it across the Atlantic. It would be the aircraft that kept Allied logistics functioning across oceans for the duration of the conflict. It was born directly from the lessons of the DC-4E's failure. Japan acquired the failure. America retained the lessons. The mathematics told a different story, one that no amount of ingenuity could rewrite. The purchase, 1939. The summer of 1939 is a pivotal moment in world history. In Europe, the mechanisms of catastrophe are moving into their final positions. In the Pacific, the tensions between Japan and the Western powers are thickening with each passing month, but the formal state of war that will eventually engulf the Pacific has not yet arrived. Japan and the United States are still trading partners, still connected by the commercial channels that the modern world has built. And it is through precisely those channels that the DC-4E makes its final journey. The negotiation is conducted with the kind of businesslike discretion that international commercial transactions of the era routinely employed. The Japanese buyer, formally representing commercial aviation interests, as was the established practice of the period, makes inquiries through appropriate channels. The aircraft, after all, is not secret. It has appeared in the aviation press. Its specifications are broadly known within the industry. It is a retired prototype with no military application, sitting in a hangar, costing money without generating value. From Douglas's perspective, selling it recovers some portion of the development investment. From an American national security perspective, the mid-1930s calculus did not yet include the alarm that would characterize the early 1940s. The aircraft is purchased. It is carefully disassembled by a Japanese technical team working under the supervision of American engineers, a provision of the sale that would have seemed routine at the time, though it would later be understood as a systematic knowledge extraction exercise of considerable sophistication. Every component is numbered, catalogued, and documented. The technical team does not merely observe the disassembly, they measure, they photograph, they sketch, they write. They are doing what any intelligent engineer would do when confronted with a machine they wish to understand. They are performing an autopsy. The components are then crated and loaded onto a Japanese freighter at the port of Los Angeles. The documentation, what the Japanese technical team has assembled, accompanies them. And when the ship clears the harbor and sets its course for Japan, It carries with it what the Imperial Japanese Navy believes is the essential intellectual property of American large aircraft design. What they cannot carry with them is Carl Cover's 10 years of test pilot intuition. They cannot ship the institutional memory of Douglas's engineering department. The discussions held at a drafting table late on a Thursday afternoon. The arguments about structural margins. The decisions made after reading an obscure technical paper from a German aeronautical research institute. The informal knowledge that passes between engineers over lunch and which never appears in any formal document. They cannot acquire the understanding that comes from building the DC-4E, watching it perform, identifying its problems, and iterating towards solutions. They have the machine. They do not have the education that building the machine provided. This is the central tragedy of the Shinzan program. And it is a tragedy that will not become apparent for a long time. In the autumn of 1939, the Imperial Japanese Navy is in a state of considerable satisfaction. They have acquired, they believe, the foundation of a new generation of strategic air power. 18 months in the dark. The development of the G5N Shinzan, the aircraft that arrives in Japan, is not shipped to a museum or a research display. It is delivered directly to Nakajima Aircraft Company, which has received the Navy's contract to develop the 13-She large attack aircraft, and whose engineers received the created components with the focused intensity of men who understand the magnitude of what they have been given. Nakajima is no minor concern. By 1939, it is one of the largest and most capable aircraft manufacturers in Asia, with a track record of producing combat aircraft of genuine quality. The company's fighters have fought in China. Its engineers have tackled aerodynamic problems of real sophistication. The men assigned to the Shinzan project are, within the context of Japanese aviation, among the best their industry can offer. They begin with the DC-4E as their conceptual starting point, though not as a direct copy. The task is transformation, taking an aircraft designed to carry passengers across American skies and reconceiving it as a long-range naval bomber capable of projecting Japanese air power across the Pacific. The fuselage is redesigned, the wing geometry is modified, the power plant installation is reconsidered. In the most fundamental sense, Nakajima is not building the DC-4E. They are building a new aircraft that has learned, or believes it has learned, from the DC-4E's solutions. The chosen engines are the Mitsubishi Kasei, a 14-cylinder twin-row radial that is among the most powerful aircraft engines Japan has produced at this stage of the war. 4 of them are mounted on the wing in the same general configuration as the DC-4E's Pratt & Whitney's. The landing gear arrangement follows the DC-4E's revolutionary tricycle configuration, one of the few direct inheritances from the donor aircraft that would translate without significant modification. The crew accommodation is adapted for a military profile, the pressurized passenger cabin replaced by military stations, weapons positions, and the bomb-aiming infrastructure of an offensive aircraft. The work takes longer than anticipated. This is, in retrospect, an early warning signal that the program's observers might have read with more alarm than they did. The engineering challenges that accumulate during development, the unexpected aerodynamic behaviors, the control surface issues, the engine cooling problems, the structural dynamics that emerge in ways the DC-4ES data did not fully predict. Each of these is a small sign of a larger reality. The Nakajima engineers are not building on a mature foundation of understood technology. They are in many ways discovering the problems of large aircraft design for themselves, in real time, without the benefit of the decades of incremental American learning that the DC-4E's specifications implicitly encoded. The first prototype, which would receive the designation G5N1, is ready for initial ground testing in the spring of 1940. The design team surveys what they have built, with the justifiable pride of engineers who have brought an extraordinarily complex technical object into existence against a demanding schedule. The aircraft is large, very large by Japanese standards of the period, with a wingspan that rivals the DC-4E it was derived from. Its 4 Kasei engines represent a substantial commitment of Japan's finest power plant technology. Its lines are clean, purposeful, and in the photographic record that survives, genuinely impressive. The first flight takes place in April of 1940, and it is in the air that the Shinzan reveals what its blueprints could never have shown. The air does not lie. What the flight tests revealed, there is a moment in the testing of every aircraft when the gap between design intention and aerodynamic reality becomes undeniable. For some programs, this moment is a minor correction, a trim tab adjustment, a small change to control authority, a refinement of the power management procedures. For others, it is a crisis. For the Shinzan, it was a slow, methodical accumulation of disappointments that, taken together, amounted to the same thing. The first problem was performance. The G5N1 was slower than its specifications demanded. The shortfall was not catastrophic on paper. The difference between the required speed and the achieved speed could be measured in tens of kilometers per hour, not hundreds. But in the context of what the aircraft was meant to do, every kilometer per hour was precious. A bomber that cannot escape interception, that cannot climb above the combat altitude of enemy fighters, that cannot reach its target and return without exhausting its fuel margin, is not a bomber in any operational sense. It is a very expensive target. The second problem was the engines. The Mitsubishi Kasei units installed in the G5N1 were capable power plants, but the installation exposed cooling deficiencies that had not appeared in ground testing. In flight, at the power settings required to haul the aircraft's substantial mass through the sky, the cooling demands exceeded what the cowling design could accommodate. Engine temperatures climbed into ranges that concerned the flight test engineers. Modifications were required. The modifications were made. The improvements were partial. The problem remained, in diminished but persistent form, a shadow over the program. The third problem was structural. The aircraft's wing, in the high-stress conditions of aggressive maneuvering and turbulent air, exhibited behaviors that the structural analysis had not fully predicted. This was not unusual for a first prototype. Virtually every aircraft of ambition discovers structural surprises in flight testing. But the process of identifying, analyzing, and correcting each surprise took time. And time was, though the program's participants did not yet fully appreciate this, running out. The test pilots who flew the G5N1 during this period were professionals of the highest caliber, trained to the exacting standards of Imperial Japanese naval aviation. Their flight reports, assembled with the precision that military technical documentation demands, paint a consistent picture. The aircraft flies. It is controllable. It can take off and land without undue drama, but it does not perform as a strategic bomber must perform. The ceiling is insufficient. The speed is insufficient. The range, when calculated honestly against the fuel consumption that the actual flight tests reveal, rather than the theoretical figures that the design estimates projected, is insufficient. These are not subjective impressions. They are numbers, and the numbers read against the Navy's operational requirements, tell a story that the engineers at Nakajima receive with the particular pain that only a craftsman who has worked for 2 years on a single object can fully feel when that object refuses to be what he made it to be. The sky, in the end, does not negotiate. It does not accept arguments about design intent or engineering rationale. It simply imposes its physics impassively on everything that enters it. The search for solutions, G5N1 to G5N2, the response to the G5N1's performance shortfalls is, by the institutional logic of military aviation programs in wartime, entirely predictable. Rather than terminating the program and accepting the loss, the Navy and Nakajima agree to a development iteration. The problems will be addressed. The performance will be improved. The G5N2 will be what the G5N1 should have been. The primary intervention is the power plant. The Mitsubishi Kasei engines that powered the G5N1 are replaced with the Mitsubishi Kasei 12 in the G5N2, a more powerful variant that promises better performance across the altitude range that the aircraft needs to reach. The installation is modified to address the cooling deficiencies identified in earlier testing. The cowl design is revised. The oil cooling arrangement is reconfigured. Additional modifications address the aerodynamic issues. The control surfaces are refined. The fuselage cross-section is adjusted in areas where drag analysis suggests improvement is possible. The structural concerns are addressed through reinforcement in the areas where the flight tests identified unexpected loading. Each of these changes represents genuine engineering work of real quality. The men doing it are not incompetent. They are solving real problems with real skill. What they cannot solve with engineering ingenuity alone is the fundamental arithmetic of the aircraft's size, weight, and power relationship. The Shinzan is large. Its size is intrinsic to its intended mission. You cannot carry a meaningful bomb load over 4,000 kilometers in a small aircraft, and the Navy's requirement was explicit about both the load and the range. But size brings weight, and weight demands power, and power demands fuel, and fuel adds weight, and weight reduces performance. This spiral, the weight-power-performance spiral that haunts every large aircraft designer, was eating the Shinzan's margins in ways that no individual engineering modification could fully arrest. The G5N2 flies. It is an improvement over the G5N1 in the ways that the modifications intended. The cooling problems are reduced. The control authority is marginally better. The performance, however, remains fundamentally inadequate against the Navy's requirements. The maximum speed is still well below what an operational bomber needs. The ceiling is still insufficient to place the aircraft above the effective altitude of the fighter defenses it would face over any meaningful target. The range, while somewhat improved, remains constrained by the fuel burn that four large engines in a heavy airframe inevitably impose. By this point, it is 1942. Japan and the United States have been at war for more than a year. The operational environment into which the Shinzan would have been thrust has changed radically from the environment in which it was designed to operate. The early months of the Pacific War have demonstrated, with terrible clarity, the capabilities of American fighter aviation. The assumption that a large, slow, inadequately defended bomber could penetrate American airspace and deliver its weapons against a defended target has been tested against reality. And reality has rendered its judgment. The Navy, confronting the Shinzan's performance figures in the context of this new operational reality, reaches the conclusion that the program's participants have been approaching for months. With the reluctance that always accompanies the abandonment of a significant investment, the Shinzan will not become an operational bomber. The human dimension, pilots, engineers, and the weight of failure. We must pause here, in the middle of this story of institutional failure and industrial limitation, to remember that these events were lived by human beings. Real men climbed into the Shinzan's cockpit on cold Pacific mornings and flew it through the test regimen with the professionalism that naval aviation demanded. Real engineers sat at their desks late into the night, working on solutions that would prove insufficient. Real admirals read performance reports that failed to match their hopes and had to decide what those failures meant for the fleet they were responsible for. Among the Japanese test pilots who flew the Shinzan during its development, the experience was one of controlled professional frustration. These were men trained to the absolute peak of their art, accustomed to flying aircraft that rewarded skill with performance, who found themselves at the controls of a machine that was simply not fast enough, not high-flying enough, not capable enough to do what was needed. The aircraft was not dangerous to fly in any acute sense. It did not have the vicious handling characteristics that would have made it genuinely perilous. It was, in the most deflating possible sense, simply inadequate. And there is a particular kind of professional disappointment that comes from mediocrity in a machine one has invested enormous effort in developing. It is quieter than the disappointment of outright failure, but in some ways deeper. For the engineers at Nakajima, the experience carries its own particular weight. They have worked for years on this program. They have solved genuine problems with genuine skill. The modifications they have made, the improvements they have engineered, are real achievements in their own right. But they have been insufficient. And the engineers know, with the specific, unsparing self-knowledge that technical mastery provides, exactly why. They can see, in the performance data, where the fundamental limitations lie. They can calculate the gap between what the aircraft delivers and what it would need to deliver to be useful. They understand, with a clarity that is perhaps more painful than ignorance, that what they are facing is not a problem that more engineering can solve. The admirals who must read the final assessment face a different kind of weight. They have committed resources to this program, resources that Japan, a nation of limited industrial capacity facing a war against opponents of far greater industrial scale, can ill afford to commit without return. The men who ordered the DC-4E purchased, who specified the 13 requirement, who approved the Nakajima contract and the development budget, must now account for the outcome. In the culture of Imperial Japanese military service, this accounting carries implications that go beyond professional disappointment. Careers are affected. Reputations bear the mark. But the deepest cost is the one that cannot be expressed in any individual accounting. Japan needed a strategic bomber. The Shinzan was meant to provide it. It does not. And without that capability, Japan's strategic air posture has a hole in it that will remain unfilled through the critical years of the Pacific War. The aircraft that should have been filling that hole is instead being reconverted into transports, useful for logistics but irrelevant to the strategic bombing mission that the Navy's planners had hoped to prosecute. The final assessment, conversion and closure, the formal end of the Shinzan as a weapons program, comes not with a dramatic decision or a single moment of reckoning, but with the accumulation of evidence that has been building since April of 1940. By 1943, with the Pacific War moving into its most intense phase, and Japan's industrial resources under the first real pressure of American counterattack, the calculus is inescapable. All 6 Shinzan airframes, 4 G5N1 variants and 2 G5N2 variants, are to be modified for transport service and assigned to the 1021st Kokutai. The weapons systems are removed, the bomb base structures are reconverted. The aircraft that was meant to strike at American naval power in the Pacific becomes a logistics hauler, moving personnel and equipment between bases that American pressure is increasingly threatening. It is, in the calculus of military failure, a particular kind of ending. The Shinzan does not crash in flames on a combat mission. It does not go down fighting. It simply proves, through the patient arithmetic of test data and operational analysis, that it is not what was needed, and it is repurposed for whatever modest utility its considerable size can provide, in a role that demands nothing of the capabilities it was originally meant to possess. The 1021st Kokutai operates the Shinzan transports through the increasingly desperate years of the Pacific War. The aircraft that Japan hoped would project power across thousands of kilometers of ocean instead shuttles between the contracting perimeter of Japan's Pacific Empire, carrying cargo through skies that American fighters are rendering progressively more dangerous. It is a sad final act for an aircraft that began its life as a vision of strategic dominance. The last surviving Shinzan airframes are destroyed on the ground during American bombing attacks or are scrapped following the Japanese surrender in August 1945. No complete example of the G5N Shinzan survives to the present day. What remains is documentation, technical drawings, flight test reports, performance analyses, and the historical record of what the aircraft was meant to be against the evidence of what it actually was. This wasn't a battle. It was an accounting. And the numbers had spoken years before the final entry was made. Why Douglas succeeded where Nakajima could not, the ecosystem of innovation, to understand why the Shinzan failed and why Douglas's successor aircraft succeeded. We must look beyond the individual technical decisions that separated the two programs and examine the broader ecosystems within which each was embedded, because the Shinzan's failure was not primarily a failure of engineering skill or industrial capability. It was a failure of the preconditions that make successful large aircraft development possible. When Douglas built the DC-4E, they drew on an institutional foundation that had been accumulating for more than a decade. The company had built the Cloudster, the World Cruiser, the DC-2, the DC-2, the DC-3. Each of these programs had added to a body of organizational knowledge about aerodynamic behavior at scale, about structural dynamics in large airframes, about engine installation and cooling, about the relationship between gross weight and performance that resided not in any single document, but in the collective experience of the engineers who had worked through those programs. This institutional memory was the invisible foundation beneath every Douglas design decision. Furthermore, Douglas operated within an American aviation ecosystem that provided resources and feedback mechanisms unavailable to Nakajima. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the NACA, forerunner of NASA, was conducting continuous research in wind tunnels and test facilities that generated aerodynamic data freely available to American manufacturers. American universities were training aeronautical engineers and conducting basic research that fed into industrial practice. American airlines, with their ruthless commercial focus and their intimate knowledge of what operational aircraft actually demanded of their systems, provided a feedback channel of extraordinary quality. The DC-4E's commercial failure was, paradoxically, one of the most valuable events in Douglas's corporate history. It told them, with brutal precision, and at the airline's expense rather than the government's, exactly what the next aircraft needed to be. Nakajima had none of this. Japanese aeronautical research was less mature, less institutionalized, and less connected to the practical demands of large aircraft operations. Japan had no commercial aviation network of the scale and sophistication that had tested and refined American aircraft through the 1930s. The military culture that dominated Japanese aviation development placed different emphasis than the commercial culture that shaped American programs. Fighter performance, maneuverability, and offensive capability were celebrated, while the grinding work of making large aircraft economical and reliable across vast oceanic distances was less thoroughly theorized. The Shinzan's engineers understood the DC, 4E solutions, the tricycle gear, the pressurization approach, the general geometry of the wing and fuselage relationship. What they could not understand, because it was not present in the aircraft they disassembled, was the process by which Douglas had arrived at those solutions. The rejected alternatives, the failed experiments, the aerodynamic surprises that had been discovered and corrected during development, all of that institutional knowledge was absent from the crated components that crossed the Pacific in 1939. Meanwhile, Douglas itself was taking the lessons of the DC-4E's failure and applying them to a new design. The simplified DC-4, unpressurized, with a conventional single vertical tail replacing the DC-4E's triple tail arrangement, rationalized for easier maintenance and lower operating costs, entered service in 1942 as the C-54 Skymaster in its military form. It would carry Franklin Roosevelt to the Yalta Conference. It would supply Berlin during the blockade. It would serve in virtually every theater of the Second World War. It was everything the DC-4E had failed to be, built on everything the DC-4E had taught its creators. 2 programs, 1 machine. The nation that owned the failure learned from it. The nation that purchased the failure had nothing to learn from except the failure itself. The doctrine of acquisition versus the doctrine of development. There is a philosophical lesson embedded in the Shinzan story that extends far beyond the Pacific War and the aircraft programs of the 1930s and 40s. It is a lesson about the nature of technological knowledge, about what can be transferred between contexts and what cannot, about the difference between possessing a solution and understanding the problem it solves. Japan's approach to the DC-4E was not foolish by the standards of rational institutional decision-making. Given what they could observe, an American aircraft of genuine technical sophistication that their competitors had developed at enormous expense, acquiring it and attempting to learn from it was a logical strategy. It was the strategy that had served Japan's modernization since the Meiji era, when the country had systematically imported Western technology and adapted it to Japanese needs. In many domains, that strategy had produced results of extraordinary quality. The Zero fighter, after all, incorporated lessons from foreign aviation in its design and proved itself one of the finest aircraft of its era. But the Zero's excellence came from Japanese engineers who understood the problem deeply enough to make creative choices about which foreign lessons to incorporate and how. They were not copying a foreign aircraft. They were designing a Japanese aircraft with the benefit of foreign aeronautical knowledge as one input among many. The institutional knowledge to make those creative choices wisely was present in the program. With the Shinzan, the situation was different. The program began not with a design problem that Japanese engineers were solving by drawing on foreign knowledge, but with a foreign solution that Japanese engineers were attempting to adapt to a different problem. The direction of causation matters enormously. An engineer who understands the problem can select the relevant lessons from a foreign example and discard the irrelevant ones. An engineer who begins with a foreign solution and works backward toward the problem is always at risk of importing not just the solutions, but the assumptions that constrained them, assumptions that may be entirely inappropriate to the new context. The DC-4E's configuration reflected its origins as an airliner. Its size reflected passenger capacity requirements. Its weight reflected the pressurization system that commercial passengers demanded. Its performance envelope reflected the altitude and speed that commercial operations required. When Nakajima attempted to build a bomber from this foundation, they inherited all of these constraints that had nothing to do with the requirements of a naval attack aircraft. and found themselves engineering against them at every stage of the program. The Americans, by contrast, took the lessons of the DC-4E, lessons about what works and what does not at this scale of aircraft, lessons about the relationship between structural weight and performance, lessons about engine installation and cooling, and applied them to a clean sheet design optimized for its actual purpose. The C-54 Skymaster is not a modified DC-4E. It is a new aircraft that exists because the DC-4E was built, failed, and taught its creators what they needed to know. This distinction between learning from failure and merely inheriting failure's constraints is the deepest lesson of the Shinzan story, and it is a lesson that echoes across the history of technology transfer in ways that extend far beyond aviation. What they didn't know, in the end, was not contained in any blueprint. It was contained in every decision that was made before the blueprint existed. The lesson that outlasts the war. Carl Cover flew the DC-4E over Dayton, Ohio, in the summer of 1938, and on that flight he carried a passenger of singular historical significance. Orville Wright, one half of the partnership that had made all of this possible, the man who had lain prone on the wing of the flyer at Kitty Hawk 35 years earlier and briefly touched the sky, sat beside Carl Cover as the most sophisticated airliner of its age carried them over the cradle of American aviation. It was one of those moments that the 20th century occasionally produced, where the distance between the beginning and the present became viscerally, emotionally real. Orville Wright did not live to see the end of the Pacific War. He died in January of 1948, in the war's aftermath, in a world that aviation had changed beyond anything he could have fully imagined from the sand dunes of Kitty Hawk. But the aircraft he rode over Dayton had, by then, traced its strange double trajectory through history. The DC-4E had taught Douglas everything they needed to know to build the C-54 Skymaster, and the C-54 Skymaster had helped win the war that the DC-4E, in its Japanese incarnation as the Shinzan, had failed to support. The Shinzan story is, at its deepest level, a story about the nature of knowledge, not the kind of knowledge that lives in blueprints and specifications, the kind that can be transferred across oceans in crates aboard freighters, measured and catalogued and documented with perfect fidelity. It is about the other kind of knowledge, the kind that lives in the accumulation of decisions made by people who understood a problem deeply enough to solve it, the kind that cannot be separated from the institutional context in which it was generated, the kind that the DC-4E embodied not in its rivets, but in its relationship to everything that came before it and everything that came after. Japan bought the machine, America kept the understanding, and in the final analysis, between a machine without its understanding and an understanding without its machine, there is only one outcome possible. The Shinzan never reverberated. Its name promised thunder and delivered silence. And in that silence, if we listen carefully enough, we can still hear the lesson it teaches about the difference between acquiring knowledge and actually possessing it. A lesson as relevant in the age of artificial intelligence and semiconductor technology as it was in the age of radial engines and aluminum airframes. Orville Wright flew 39 meters at Kitty Hawk in 1903 and changed the world forever. 35 years later, Carl Cover flew him over Dayton in an aircraft that would, within months, cross the Pacific under Japanese ownership, be transformed by capable engineers working against impossible institutional odds, fly 6 disappointing prototypes, and then fall silent. History does not always reward ambition. Sometimes it rewards only understanding.